There are things in your life that don't look like rebellion. They don't feel like sin. They don't even bother your conscience anymore. And that's exactly why they're dangerous. Because separation from God rarely begins with something obvious. It begins quietly, subtly, gradually, not with a moment, but with a habit. And you can still pray. You can still worship. You can still call yourself a believer while something in your spirit is slowly drifting. Have you felt that? That strange distance you can't explain. That silence where there used to be clarity. That heaviness that shows up even when nothing is wrong. It feels confusing because on the outside everything looks normal. But something is off, and deep down you know it. The Bible is clear. God does not randomly withdraw His presence. He does not play games with your peace. So when distance appears, when sensitivity fades, when conviction becomes quiet, you have to ask a hard question. What changed? Because something did. And in most cases, it's not one big decision. It's a pattern you allowed. A habit you normalized. Something small that you stopped taking seriously. This is where many believers get it wrong. They are not running from God. They are not rejecting Him. They are simply tolerating things that slowly push Him out of the center. Not all at once, but little by little. And today, we're going to expose 6 of those habits. Not the obvious ones, not the ones everyone talks about, but the quiet ones, the ones that sit comfortably in your routine, the ones you've justified, the ones you've stopped questioning. Let's start with the first, and this one is more common than you think. 1. Neglecting time with God while calling it being busy. It sounds harmless. It sounds responsible. It even sounds necessary. You have things to do, responsibilities to carry, people depending on you. So you tell yourself, I'll pray later. I'll read tomorrow. I just need to get through today first. And slowly, without realizing it, God becomes something you fit in, instead of the one you build your life around. This is not about perfection. This is not about checking a religious box. This is about priority. Because what you consistently delay, you eventually disconnect from. It doesn't happen in one day. You don't wake up suddenly distant from God. It starts with shortened prayers, rushed moments, distracted reading, then it becomes occasional, then inconsistent, and eventually, optional. And here's the part most people don't want to admit. You still believe in God. You still agree with His truth. But your daily life no longer revolves around His presence. It sounds small, but it changes everything. Because relationship requires attention. Not occasional attention, not leftover attention, intentional attention. The Bible says to seek Him diligently, not casually, not when it's convenient, diligently. That means there is effort, there is pursuit, there is priority. But this habit replaces pursuit with postponement, and the longer you postpone, the easier it becomes to live without that closeness. You may not notice it immediately, but your sensitivity begins to dull. Conviction becomes quieter. Discernment becomes weaker. Peace becomes inconsistent. Not because God moved away, but because you stopped drawing near. And this is where the deception deepens, because your life might still look fine. You're functioning, you're working, you're handling things. So you assume everything is okay. But spiritual distance doesn't always disrupt your schedule. It disrupts your alignment. You start making decisions without seeking Him. You rely more on your logic than His guidance. You react instead of being led. And slowly, your life becomes centered on you again. Not intentionally, but practically. And this is why this habit is so dangerous, because it doesn't feel like rebellion. It feels like survival. But there is a difference between managing your life and surrendering it. Jesus Himself made time, not because He had nothing to do, but because He refused to function without connection. So if even He withdrew to be with God, what makes you think you can stay strong without it? This is where you have to be honest, not defensive, not dismissive, honest. Have you replaced time with God with excuses that sound reasonable? Have you allowed busyness to become distance? Because if you're always too busy for God, you are busier than He ever intended you to be. And no matter how productive you feel, a disconnected spirit will eventually show it. So here's the correction. Not complicated, but intentional. You don't find time for God. You make it. You protect it. You treat it as necessary, not optional. Even if it's quiet, even if it's simple, Even if it doesn't feel powerful at first, you show up because consistency rebuilds sensitivity, and what feels distant begins to come back into focus. But if you ignore this, if you keep delaying, if you keep telling yourself later, that distance will grow, quietly, steadily, almost invisibly, until one day you realize you don't hear him the way you used to. And by then, it didn't happen suddenly. It happened daily. This next habit is more subtle and more dangerous because it doesn't look like distance at all. In fact, it can look like kindness, but underneath it, there's compromise. 2. Prioritizing people's approval over God's truth. This one is subtle because it hides behind good intentions. You don't want conflict. You don't want to offend. You don't want to seem extreme. So, you adjust. Not completely, just slightly. You soften what you say. You stay quiet when you should speak. You go along when something feels off, and you tell yourself, it's not a big deal. I'm just being wise. I don't want to push people away. But here's the truth. Every time you choose approval over obedience, something shifts inside you. Not always loudly, but deeply. Because you were not called to blend in. You were called to stand in truth. And truth is not always comfortable. Not always accepted, not always applauded. So when you begin adjusting truth to maintain acceptance, you are no longer standing on it. You are negotiating with it. And that negotiation creates distance. It starts small. You laugh at something you shouldn't. You stay silent when something dishonors God. You tolerate conversations that pull your spirit down, not because you agree, but because you don't want to stand out. And slowly, your standard begins to shift. What once bothered you no longer feels serious. What once convicted you becomes normal. This is how compromise works, not through sudden rebellion, but gradual adjustment. And the danger is this: you can still feel like a good person. You can still justify your behavior. You can still say, God understands. But obedience is not measured by intention. It's revealed through action. Jesus was clear. If you are ashamed of him, if you deny him before people, there are consequences to that. And denying him doesn't always look like rejection. Sometimes it looks like silence. Silence when truth is needed. Silence when conviction is present. Silence when compromise is happening right in front of you. You don't have to be loud. You don't have to argue. But you cannot keep choosing comfort over truth and expect to stay close to God. Because closeness requires alignment. And when your actions start aligning more with people than with God, distance begins. This doesn't mean you become harsh. It doesn't mean you lose compassion. But it does mean this: you stop adjusting truth to protect acceptance. Because approval is temporary, but alignment with God is everything. So ask yourself honestly, where have you been choosing comfort over obedience? Where have you stayed quiet just to keep peace? Because not all peace is from God. Some peace comes from avoiding truth, and that kind of peace will cost you your closeness with Him. There are habits that don't look dangerous at all. They don't feel heavy. They don't trigger immediate conviction. In fact, some of them feel completely normal. And that's what makes them dangerous. Because when something feels normal, you stop questioning it. You stop guarding against it. You stop recognizing what it's doing to you. The first two habits we expose were visible if you were honest. This next one is different. It doesn't look like distance. It looks like expression. It looks like harmless release. It even looks like just being real. But underneath it, something is being shaped inside you, slowly, consistently, powerfully. 3. Feeding your spirit with what you call just entertainment. Be honest. Not everything you consume is neutral. You already know that. The shows, the music, the conversations, the content you scroll through when no one is watching. You may call it relaxation. You may call it harmless, but your spirit is still taking it in. And here's the truth most people avoid. What consistently enters your mind eventually shapes your spirit. It doesn't ask for permission. It doesn't wait for agreement. It just forms. You don't have to believe something for it to influence you. That's why this habit is so deceptive. Because you can sit there and say, it doesn't affect me. I don't take it seriously. It's just entertainment. But if it wasn't affecting you, you wouldn't keep going back to it. Something in it is feeding something in you. And not all of it is good. Pay attention to what it normalizes. Pay attention to what it makes you comfortable with. Pay attention to what stops bothering you, because that's where the shift is happening. You start tolerating language that once felt wrong. You start laughing at things that once convicted you. You start desiring things that pull you away from purity, not overnight, but gradually. And the more you consume it, the more it settles into you, until one day your spiritual sensitivity is no longer sharp. You don't feel the same conviction. You don't recognize the same boundaries. You don't respond the same way to truth. And again, it feels normal. But normal is not always safe. The Bible calls you to guard your heart. Not casually, not occasionally. Guard it, because what enters doesn't just pass through, it leaves something behind. Now, this doesn't mean you isolate yourself from everything. It doesn't mean you become extreme or disconnected from reality. But it does mean this. You become aware. You become selective. You become protective, because your spirit is not designed to absorb everything without consequence. So ask yourself honestly, what are you consistently feeding your mind? What are you allowing into your private moments? What are you calling harmless that is slowly reshaping your spirit? Because if you don't guard what enters, you will eventually lose control of what grows, and what grows will influence how close you feel to God. This next habit is even more subtle, because it doesn't involve what you take in, it involves what you hold on to. 4. Holding onto offense while pretending you've moved on. This one hides well, because on the surface, you look fine. You're not arguing. You're not reacting. You're not bringing it up anymore. So you tell yourself, I'm over it. It doesn't matter anymore. I've moved on. But deep down, something is still there. A tension, a resistance, a quiet distance in your heart when you think about that person. And you've learned how to manage it. You've learned how to ignore it. You've learned how to function around it. But you haven't released it. And what you don't release, you carry. This is where many believers get stuck, because they confuse silence with healing. Just because you stop talking about it doesn't mean it's gone. An offense is not passive. It does something to your spirit. It hardens you, not all at once, but gradually. It changes how you respond. It changes how you trust. It changes how you love. And most dangerously, it affects your relationship with God, because you cannot hold on to bitterness and remain fully open to His presence. It blocks something. Not because God rejects you, but because your heart is no longer aligned. The Bible is direct about this. Forgiveness is not optional, not because the other person deserves it, but because your spirit needs it. And this is where it gets uncomfortable, because holding on to offense can feel justified. They hurt you, they were wrong, they don't deserve your forgiveness. All of that may be true, but your obedience is not based on what they deserve. It's based on what God requires. And when you delay forgiveness, you are not just holding on to pain, you are holding on to separation. Because offense creates distance, not just between you and others, but between you and God. You may still pray, you may still worship, but something feels restricted, something feels blocked, and it's not always obvious why, until you realize you've been carrying something God told you to release. Forgiveness is not pretending it didn't happen. It's not excusing behavior. It's choosing to let go, so your heart can stay free, and freedom is where God's presence flows. So be honest with yourself. Is there someone you've avoided forgiving? Is there something you've buried instead of released? Because what you bury alive doesn't stay dead. It grows in the dark, and eventually, it will affect your spirit. By now, you're starting to see the pattern. These habits don't announce themselves. They don't feel extreme. They don't immediately disrupt your life. They settle in quietly. They blend into your routine. They hide behind logic. They disguise themselves as normal. And if you don't confront them, they will slowly reshape your spirit. We've already exposed 4. But these last 2 are the ones many believers completely miss, not because they're rare, but because they often feel justified. 5. Relying on feelings instead of truth. This one is dangerous because it feels spiritual. You don't want to be fake. You don't want to force anything. You want your faith to be real, so you begin to measure everything by how you feel. If I feel close to God, I'm doing well. If I don't feel anything, something must be wrong. If it doesn't feel right, I won't do it. And slowly, your feelings become your guide, not truth, not obedience. Feelings, But feelings are unstable. They shift, they fluctuate. They respond to circumstances, moods, and moments. Truth does not. And when you start following what you feel, instead of what God has said, you create inconsistency in your walk. One day you're passionate. The next day you're distant. One moment you're committed. The next moment you're unsure. Not because God changed, but because your foundation did. This is where many believers quietly drift, because obedience becomes conditional. I'll pray when I feel like it. I'll read when I'm in the mood. I'll obey when it feels right. But obedience was never designed to be driven by emotion. It's driven by trust. You don't follow God because it feels good. You follow Him because He is right, because He is true, because He is God. Even when it's quiet, even when it's dry, even when it doesn't feel powerful, you stay consistent, because consistency builds depth, and depth sustains you. When feelings disappear, here's the truth most people avoid. Some of your most important spiritual moments will feel ordinary. No emotion, no intensity, no visible result, just obedience. And if you walk away from those moments because they don't feel meaningful, you will miss what God is doing beneath the surface. Because God is not always loud, He is not always dramatic, but He is always working. So when you rely on feelings, you begin to misinterpret silence as absence, and that's where distance begins. You stop showing up, you stop engaging, you stop pursuing. Not because God left, but because you stopped responding. This is why you must anchor yourself in truth. Not your emotions, not your mood, not your current state, truth. Because truth remains steady, even when you don't. So ask yourself, have you been letting your feelings decide how close you stay to God? Because if your faith is built on emotion, it will collapse under pressure. But if it's built on truth, it will stand. No matter what you feel. Now, this last habit is the one people almost never question. In fact, many people think it's a strength. But if you're honest, it's one of the biggest reasons for quiet distance. 6. Trying to handle everything on your own. This doesn't look like weakness. It looks like strength. You're responsible. You're capable. You figure things out. You don't complain. You don't rely on others too much. You just handle it. And over time, that mindset becomes your default. Even in your relationship with God, you still believe in Him. You still acknowledge Him. But practically, you operate independently. You make decisions without asking. You move forward without seeking. You carry burdens without surrendering. And you don't even realize it's happening because it feels productive. It feels efficient. It feels strong. But it's not dependence. And your relationship with God was never meant to function without it. God does not call you to manage your life alone. He calls you to walk with Him daily, actively, intentionally. But when you start relying on yourself, you reduce that relationship to occasional moments instead of constant connection. You pray when things get overwhelming. You seek Him when you run out of answers. But in the everyday decisions, the small moments, the quiet choices, you rely on you. And this is where distance quietly grows, because dependence creates closeness, and independence creates space. Not dramatic space, not obvious space, but enough to weaken your sensitivity. You stop recognizing His guidance as quickly. You stop seeking His direction as often. You stop involving Him as naturally. And slowly, your life becomes self-directed, even if your beliefs haven't changed. This is subtle, but it's serious. Because God is not meant to be your backup plan. He is meant to be your source. Not someone you consult occasionally, but someone you walk with constantly. So when you carry everything alone, you're not just carrying weight. You're creating distance. And that distance doesn't always feel heavy at first, but over time, it will show. In your decisions, in your peace, in your direction. So here's the correction. You start involving God again. Not just in the big things, in everything. Before decisions, during struggles, in quiet moments. You ask, you listen, you surrender. Even when it feels unnecessary, even when you think you already know the answer. Because dependence is not weakness, it's alignment. And alignment is where closeness is restored. Final reflection: none of these habits looked extreme. None of them felt like rebellion. And that's the point. Because the enemy doesn't always need to pull you away from God suddenly. He just needs you to drift slowly, a little less time, a little more compromise, a little less sensitivity, a little more independence. Until one day, distance feels normal. But it doesn't have to stay that way, because every one of these habits can be reversed, not with pressure, not with perfection, but with awareness and obedience. You return to God intentionally. You realign your priorities. You guard what enters your spirit. You release what you've been holding. You stand on truth. You walk in dependence, step by step, choice by choice. And what felt distant begins to come close again, not because God moved, but because you did. And now you're coming back.